Okay, welcome. This is the LaRouche Pack Saturday night class. We've got special guest Ben Deniston tonight, and I'll be moderating, Mike Stager, for those of you who don't know me. And just to give a quick introduction to what's developed, how things are moving. I think we're all familiar now with a phrase called follow the science. Now, people shouldn't follow probably anything. You probably should follow the laws just as a precautionary safe measure. That's kind of the compact we have to keep basic stability. But other than that, the one thing that should never just be followed is science. And what's happened today, whether it's with climate change, which will be a factor that Ben's addressing tonight, or now what we see with COVID, you have basically corrupted the institution of science, the temple of science, as Einstein called it, in referring to Max Planck, into a kind of authoritarian cult. Now, this has been taking place for over 120 years. And LaRouche Pack will address this more on Monday with the strategic update in terms of what's happening, because you now have massive protests in France over vaccine passports and mandatory vaccines. You have protests all over the country in Michigan and Texas and New York. There's outrage over vaccine passports. You have to now qualify your clients. Well, if you haven't gotten a vaccine, I can't fix your computer, was one famous quote from a guy named Louis Rossmann. But the science is a question of why. Why do things occur? Not just what. And that is one of the massive corruptions of science. You've got total empiricism flouting itself as some type of scientific orientation. It never has been. It was always a concocted program. If you go back to Bob Ingram's lectures here at LaRouche Pack, from the standpoint of Venice, the creation of people like Galileo to be so-called the science, much like Fauci today, a bureaucrat turned into someone who considers himself the science. But science is a much deeper question of why things occur. And from that standpoint, we go, why is this taking place? Why is this virus now spreading? Well, it's, of course, the origin question was one question. And then you have the approach. How do we approach something like this dynamic? Well, that's not been a discussion the entire time. What has been taking place is a process of social control, outright and total fascist social control, meaning the government and leading corporations in control to fundamentally deprive you, the individual, of your God-given rights, most important of which is creative and scientific thought, and the ability to express those hypotheses and ideas and thoughts in collaboration with your fellow citizens, fellow human beings, towards scientific advancement, the advancement of statecraft, and the advancement of art itself. What that means is that we are facing a deep spiritual crisis inside Western civilization, something that Lyndon LaRouche clearly forewarned. And he recognized that if that principle, that quality of divine in the individual, would be compromised, you would also destroy any ability to solve the major economic problems that exist and face a nation like ours today. At the same time, to challenge this system, we have to know the means and policies to address real economic advancement. That the ability to apply one's creative thought also means a strategic sense of how do we address the great crises facing us today. Now, later next week, we'll have a drought report up from Pat Ruckert, someone who's been following the drought for 10 years, who covers extensively the spreading of the fires, the rapid acceleration of the impact of the drought, or you could say its control by bureaucrats like Gavin Newsom, who's facing recall in California, by targeting farmers, targeting the food production and industrial sector, which they've been doing for decades, rather than addressing the actual need for increasing the water supply. Or as Lyndon LaRouche famously put in a pamphlet now nearly 35 years ago, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. So here we have Ben Deniston, who's been covering the questions from a galactic as well as solar system level to address the questions of climate change, the drought, and what we as a human species, how our divine qualities of creative thought give us a handle on how to address these bigger questions and are the basis for a shift in American politics today. So Ben, at that, I'll basically hand it off to you and see what you have to say.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Glad to be on again. Just picking up right off of what Mike just laid down. I mean, this drought is a massive crisis, and we need a shift. We need a shift in the mentality of the population. We need a shift in the political leadership. We have to take this seriously. We've pushed this back too long. You know, we could take a whole presentation here to discuss the history of LaRouche PAC and Lyndon LaRouche in fighting on this water issue, fighting for NWAPA, fighting for desalination, fighting for water development throughout the West, fighting for infrastructure. I mean, we've been out front for 50 years now, literally 50 years. Our organization, LaRouche, more recently LaRouche PAC, you know, Mr. LaRouche always had taken this water issue very seriously. And here we are today, and it's a crisis that's probably worse than it's ever been, at least for the United States and in the Western region of the United States. And as Mike just alluded to, and another LaRouche PAC contributor, Michael Carr, has an article on our website. I encourage people to look at a short summary of some of the situation in the West and some ideas for how to begin to address it. But this is a crisis. California is one of, if not the most important agricultural region in the country. You know, it doesn't produce everything there, but what it does produce is unique and extensive crops that are incredibly important to the food supply of this country, and trade and, you know, various other aspects. You know, that's just one element of it. You know, the drought obviously extends beyond just California. So this is now becoming an issue of life or death, right? This is not, you know, just a, you know, intermediate problem that's going to pass away. This is life or death for thousands, if not millions of people. This is a question about, is the West going to be habitable? Can people live in the West? Can we sustain the Western population? Can we sustain the agriculture? Can we sustain the cities? Can we sustain the people, right? And then you got this insane administration working on behalf of a globalist faction, you know, aligned with the British, you know, the modern incarnation of the British financial empire. They don't care. They want depopulation. They want population reduction around the world. They want reduction of living standards, right? So they're running around pushing this insane Green New Deal, pushing this climate change narrative, which we're going to get into, and they're doing nothing to save the population of the West. So we need to get out front and we need to take leadership on this issue. So I wanted to go through a little bit of a picture of some of what we've been looking at, and this is going to be an evolving perspective from LaRouche PAC. Like Mike said, Pat Ruckert's going to have more. You know, Brian Lance has been looking at this issue. Michael Carr has been looking at this issue. So we're going to have an evolving series of material covering the drought in the context of this fight against the Green New Deal, fight for real infrastructure, not what the Democrats put forward and not this stupid, compromise, idiotic infrastructure perspective the Republicans are moving on, but real development, real solutions to our needs, right? So what I want to talk about tonight, we're going to talk about the drought and the solutions predominantly, some of what can be done to solve this issue. And that's what we're talking about, solving the issue, not crisis mediation, not just getting by this year, but let's finally fix this damn thing, and let's fix it for generations to come. Let's take emergency measures, do as much as we can rapidly, and ensure that in generations' time, we've completely addressed the problem. And then I want to talk about climate science, but from a better perspective than what you get, just to put it lightly. And we'll get into that, what the real science of climate change is and how mankind needs to be thinking about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about real science, reflect on what's happened in the name of science, and how science, in a sense, the word science, the authority of the word science, has really been weaponized the same way COVID was weaponized as a means of thought control and population control, right? like Mike was just saying, follow the science, follow the science. Don't ask what the science means. Don't ask how those conclusions were arrived at. Don't ask, what underlies the supposed conclusions that have been presented to you. Just follow it, follow it, follow it, follow it. Oh, you question? You want to know why that conclusion is deemed to be what the answer is? Oh, you don't believe in the science. And I think we've all experienced that. So this is a updated picture of the drought in the United States. This is from the US Drought Monitor. You can always go to this site and get an updated picture. They have a lot of good data. They have historical data going back, I think, to around the year 2000, something to that effect. At least the past 10 years, I think past 20 years or so. They have state by state, region by region, depictions of the drought conditions throughout the United States. And as we can see here, obviously there's different gradations of it. The darkest red is the most extreme, the most exceptional drought. I believe is a specific term, exceptional drought. And it's massive. Pretty much the entire West is in some level of drought. And much of it, well over half, is in the most intense forms of drought, what they call extreme or exceptional drought. And so this is here. This is a serious crisis, and this is something we got to tackle. So what we want to talk about is the solutions. What are we going to do? And I always find it useful to go back to, maybe what you learned in grade school, hopefully, at least those of us who are a little bit older and got some education in school. Go back to what the broader context for water resources. You're talking about the water cycle, right? Water is not like gas, like petroleum. Water is not like coal. Water is not like iron, right? It's not just a deposit that's been there for millions of years that we're unearthing and utilizing. That was the product of millions of years of biospheric activity and biological activity, like a lot of the resources we use are. It's part of a cycle, a very interesting and fascinating cyclical system, right? Where you constantly have this flux of water out of the oceans, and in fact, desalinating the water, right? Removing the fresh water from the oceans, evaporating it, putting it into the atmosphere, precipitating down over land, becoming the basis for river flows, groundwater supplies, et cetera, and that water returning to the ocean. So I always like to start there, because what you're really talking about when you're talking about increasing the water supply is not just taking some water from somewhere, but augmenting and increasing a cyclical system, right? You're not using up anything, right? When we're talking about water management, developing the water resources we need, we're talking about managing and improving and enlarging a cyclical system, not drawing anything down, not using anything up, right? So I think it's important to lay that out front as a perspective to how to think about this. And I think you really have three main categories of solutions that we can look at when we want to increase the water supply, as we're discussing. You have surface water transfer, right? Think about things like the California water system, the Colorado River development, the development of the Colorado River system. You have dams, you have irrigation systems, you have canals, right? Interlinking rivers, connecting one river to another, right? So these are various ways of managing, storing, and transferring what you have largely out of existing river systems, surface transfer. And you have groundwater management, that can be a part of that, and so on. I would put that as a whole category of activity. That's one thing we need to develop, right? Improve those systems, expand those systems, enlarge those systems, and begin to address the water needs from that perspective. That's one category of approach, category of activity. Then you have desalination, which is, from the standpoint of the water cycle, the actual characteristics of the system as a whole is fundamentally different, because you're not just now managing and redistributing existing flows of water on the continental landmass. You're basically increasing the cycle as a whole. If you're talking about ocean desalination, you're taking water that was not brought on land through this process of evaporation and precipitation, You're bringing a new supply of water. You're augmenting the cycle. You're having new inputs into the continental landmass and the water availability through that process. So that's got a distinct characteristic, is going to be an incredibly important part of the solutions to the water issues for the United States and really the world in the immediate period in the coming generations. And then you have weather modification. And I'm going to spend a good amount of time on this. And I'm going to focus on particular a type of weather modification which uses ionization technologies, which uses the ability to accelerate and increase the condensation and the precipitation of atmospheric water vapor through electrical ionization systems. And we'll get into what that means. And these, I think, are probably one of the first things if we had that we want to fight to get implemented, because these can be built relatively quickly, relatively cheaply. We want to develop these other systems as well. Start expanding the surface water transfer, start building desalination, take other emergency measures as needed. But we want to really push the frontiers with this weather modification technology as soon as possible. That would be my number one priority, together with the other methods, but in terms of potentially getting some substantial relief as quickly as possible. So let's break down what we're actually looking at with each of these areas. We want to talk about surface transfer. We should first start by looking at the characteristics of the United States, the existing river systems of the United States. Here's a map of just showing the major rivers throughout the country. It might be a little bit hard to see. The text isn't all that big, but you also have the California aqueduct on there, the Colorado aqueduct on there. So you have some depiction of the existing water management systems, surface transfer systems, water diversion systems in California and the Colorado River Basin already on there. And we needed to expand those. Those were built generations ago, and they were built for a much smaller population. And they were built as just a step in an overall process of developing the water resources of the West. So some places we want to immediately look at is, one, there's more that can be done with the Sacramento River and San Joaquin rivers. I'm not going to get into a whole lot on that, but there's more potential development that is available there, although the overall input into these rivers is diminishing with the drought process. So that's not obviously not a long-term and permanent solution, but there is more water availability there that can be developed in the California systems. We could look to the Columbia River, which is a very large river, very substantial river, obviously up in Washington and down to the border of Washington and Oregon. So we could look at developing potentially some resources, water resources off of the Columbia. And we could look out to existing plans for developing the upper Missouri River, which feeds into the Mississippi. So these would be some areas where we could start to expand the existing water infrastructure, surface transfer systems into additional rivers, supplying additional inputs of water. And I think this would be viewed as a step towards the overall continental water management system designed as the North American Water and Power Alliance, NWAPA, as we see shown here. The rivers I mentioned already would be part of that process, at least part of it. Some of them are extensions that LaRouche Peck had looked at adding onto the original NWAPA design, like connecting to the Missouri River was not part of the original NWAPA, but we had worked with engineers on looking at an extension for that process. But connecting into the Sacramento River and integrating into the Columbia River, that's all part of the NWAPA system. And there are additional rivers available in British Columbia that could be built into this. So that's a lot of that's a big project, the full NWAPA project. It certainly can't be done, in a couple of years to immediately solve the crisis. But if you're looking in the long term, you have a huge disparity in the water availability in the Northwest versus the Southwest, right? Something on the order of a 10-fold, 15-fold higher amount of freshwater runoff into the oceans through extensive and large river systems up and down the northern Pacific coast, and even on the northern side of Canada and Alaska, which can be developed. And if you even brought a fraction, 5%, maybe up to 10% of that fresh water from this extensive abundance of fresh water that's just running off into the ocean in the Northwest, if you brought that down through the NWAPA design, that would be a massive, massive contribution to solving, potentially permanently solving the water issues. But that's a longer term perspective, right? On the shorter term, and some of what's more immediately available, but more specifically for coastal regions, because with NWAPA, you can begin to bring water into some of these problematic desert regions, drought regions that are further inland, up on the Great Plateau, up into the upper Colorado River Basin, right into the high plains where you have the Ogallala, the High Plains Aquifer, and you have extensive farmland up there that's running off of diminishing groundwater supplies, right? And NWAPA can do a lot to bring relief and expand the water availability in these interior regions of the continent. If you're talking about coastal regions, desalination is a technology that exists, it's been implemented, and it's something we should bring into scale immediately as rapidly as possible. A couple examples is the Sorek plant in Israel, which was completed in 2013. Very modern, very large plant. I believe it might be the largest in the world in terms of fresh water production. Highly successful operation. And then you have a little bit more recently, a smaller plant, but also very highly efficient and highly advanced in Carlsbad, California, right? So in looking at, take California as an example, if we were to take all the coastal major metropolitan areas, right? So the greater San Diego area, the greater Los Angeles area, and the Bay Area, right? The San Francisco Bay Area. That alone, and we have the counties highlighted here in this graphic, that alone accounts for almost 2/3 of the entire population of the state, 25 million people in these coastal metropolitan areas, right? And they use probably on the range of about 12% of the state's total water use for their municipal needs. So why not look at providing these major coastal regions and then moving up the coast further as needed, moving into Oregon and Washington as needed with desalination systems, right? And then leaving the water that had been supplying these cities and these metropolitan areas to where it's also desperately needed to sustain and save the immensely important agricultural production in the state by not diverting that water to the coast and let it being used further inland for agriculture. Well, to do this specific example of these major metropolitan areas on the California coast, you would need about 80 plants, desalination plants the size of the Carlsbad one in California, or 25 the size of the one in Israel, the Sorek plant, just to give you a sense, right? So if we were to build these plants, this many plants of this size, you could provide the water needs for the municipal water needs for 2/3 of the population of California immediately on those coastal regions, over 10% of the entire water needs of the state. That would be a substantial contribution, right? Again, these things can't be built overnight, but we could start to do that immediately, get some of them up and running as quickly as possible on as much of an emergency crash program basis as we can implement, and really start providing some serious long-term solutions. To do this, the big cost, the major costs, I mean, you got to build the plants, there's capital inputs and all that, you got to operate them, but they're also very energy intensive desalination systems. They're getting more and more efficient over time. Mike Carr pointed to some interesting new material technologies that might make it even more energy efficient. But at least at present technologies, it takes a good bit of energy, electricity, to push the water through these membranes to separate the fresh water from the salt and desalinate the water. So for this case study, for providing fresh water for 25 million people in these coastal regions of California, you need about 2,000 megawatts of electricity. And funny enough, that's pretty much exactly what the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant puts out, which they're about to shut down under current policies, just to give you a broader sense of the overall insanity of present policies. If we were to keep, fix up and upgrade and keep the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant running, that plant alone would provide enough electricity to provide for desalination for 25 million people, 2/3 of the population of California, just to give you a sense, right? We'd also want to build more nuclear power, expand the overall energy flux density of the economy to enable things like more significant desalination, which is another aspect of the discussion we can get into. So that's a sense with desalination. The third approach, and again, where I'm going to take a few minutes to really elaborate, is these new frontier areas of weather modification, right? Using systems of ionization to accelerate, to increase the rate of water vapor changing from an evaporated state, a gaseous state, through a phase change into condensing on nuclei to form the basis of either dew or fog or rainfall, right? Increase the precipitation of existing atmospheric water vapor. And here we see depicted an illustration of how this ionization process occurs in another way through the natural effect of cosmic radiation, where you have this very high energy radiation coming from throughout the galaxy, from exploding stars, from high energy environments in the galaxy. You produce these very high energy, very fast moving particles, what are generally called cosmic rays. And these things are barreling around the entire galaxy, into our solar system, into the inner solar system, into the Earth's atmosphere. And when they hit the Earth's atmosphere, they strip away electrons, they break apart molecules, they even change elements, they even transmute certain elements in the atmosphere because they're so energetic when they come in. But this is constantly creating a level of ionization, a separation of electrons from atoms or molecules to leave the molecules in an electrically charged state, which helps them bring in and bind with, but bring in and condense atmospheric water molecules onto them. All right, so this becomes the basis of the changing of, again, evaporated water into a liquid state, which can then can precipitate. So we see this as a natural effect. And what we'll get into in a little bit is how variations in this galactic cosmic radiation is a major contributor to the climate system itself. But modeling on that insight, moving from that insight, technologies have been developed to, instead of using high energy radiation or high energy galactic cosmic radiation or other sources of high energy particles, systems have been developed to use electrical high voltage wires, where you can create what they call a corona discharge effect. So you create these towers, these networks of towers connected by high voltage cables, and you run the right kind of current through those cables in just the right way to increase to ionize the local atmosphere, the immediate atmosphere right around those stations, that produces ions, as you see depicted here, which then move through the atmosphere and help to increase the precipitation going on in that area. Here are some images of these systems deployed in Mexico. Is a depiction of what the central tower looks like in a schematic, and unfortunately somewhat low resolution picture of one of the towers in Mexico, where they operated for a number of years from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. They had a lot of success there. Here's an image of the systems set up in Israel, where there was a trial run for a number of years, where they succeeded in filling a number of reservoirs under a contract to use this technology to fill reservoirs to provide water supplies in Israel. And here's an overview of a number of places where they've been used. Like I said, there's operations in Mexico from the late 90s to the early mid 2000s, where they did a number of things. They increased precipitation. You saw increases in agricultural production. They even used them to lower, to help control fires, which is obviously an issue that we're all seeing now in the news in the West, in California and Oregon, right? You had regions that have similar climate conditions in Mexico, which are regularly plagued with fires in a similar way. And by utilizing the systems and increasing the precipitation in these regions, you had dramatic reductions in fires in those regions, right? Israel, they were used. Australia, there's a company that developed and demonstrated the technology in a few locations in Australia, and then has recently completed a rather extensive and elaborate trial in Oman, in the Arabian Peninsula, demonstrating the technology. Russia is one of the places where the technologies were originally developed. There's been a few other cases. Here's a illustration of the actual data of filling reservoirs in Mexico. So this was from 2003 to 2005, where you had a relatively steady level of the reservoirs, as you can see, either steady or slow decline for some of them. And then you see the start in July of 2004 of the activation of these ionization systems in areas that were part of the basin, the watershed that feeds into the rivers that feed into these reservoirs, right? So you don't put them right over the reservoir, you put them in locations where they increase the precipitation in part of the watershed that feeds to a river that feeds into that reservoir. And you can see the dramatic increase in the filling of those reservoirs in the immediate aftermath of running and operating these systems. I think as I mentioned, the Oman trials are a very interesting case to look at. They ran from 2013 to 2018. They had a number of stations set up. They also set up extensive testing of these systems. And they did a lot of sophisticated analysis where they would run the systems and then turn the systems off and then turn the systems back on, or run systems in one spot but another spot, to very rigorously show that, you know, the rainfall change, the precipitation changes that were occurring was definitely attributed to the effect of these ionization systems. So they did a lot to provide statistical analysis and further demonstration against some of the people who are a little bit skeptical about this technology, showing that the precipitation that did occur in the region could be directly attributed to these ionization systems. And I think from a rather somewhat conservative estimate, they were saying 15 to 20% increase in precipitation each year. If we look at just 2014, just 1 year of operation in Oman of these ionization systems. And again, this Oman trial was run by this Australian company called Australian Rain Technologies. So the trials in Oman, but the company's called Australian Rain Technologies. So in 2014, they ran 4 of these stations. And it's interesting to note that although they run at a high voltage, the actual power input is actually relatively low. For this trial, for these stations, about 500 watts each, right? So I know we're all now moving to away from incandescent light bulbs, right? But I'm sure most of us can remember a 100-watt incandescent light bulb, right? So like 5 of those light bulbs is the amount of power going into these systems, but they put it at a very high voltage to have this corona discharge ionization effect. So running 4 of these stations for 140 days, they were able to estimate, based on precipitation patterns historically and precipitation before and after those trials, that the effect of these systems added about 100 million cubic meters, or about 80,000 acre feet of additional water into the surface water system, right? Going into rivers and streams and what have you, right? So that's a substantial increase. If you average that out over the time of operation, you're looking at an average of about 180 million gallons per day added of precipitation from the effect of these 4 stations, right? 180 million gallons a day from these 4 stations. And in terms of the energy efficiency, you got about 3.7 million gallons per kilowatt hour of energy, electricity put in. I cite those numbers because I think it's just useful to compare that with desalination. For example, taking the Carlsbad desalination plant in California. Again, I think desalination is an incredibly important technology, needs to be developed. It's part of the solution, absolutely. But it's just interesting to look at the difference between ionization, weather modification, and desalination, right? So from the data we have from these Oman trials, from this 2014 period in the Oman trial, they were averaging an increase in the fresh water input to the surface system of about 180 million gallons per day. So that's about 3 times, a little bit more than 3 times more than the fresh water produced by the Carlsbad desalination plant, which operates at about 50 million gallons per day. So just to give you a sense of the scale, they're comparable. Now, obviously, Carlsbad's giving you fresh water right into a pipe that puts it right into your water system. So that's obviously nice, right? You're not, whereas the ionization, you're just increasing the precipitation over a certain area, right? Obviously, if that area is in watersheds that feed into rivers, that feed into reservoirs, you're going to get a lot of that water into your system. So, you know, done right, a lot of that water ends up being available for use, just maybe not as directly as with desalination. But as you can see, it's comparable, right? 180 million gallons a day, average increased water, fresh water input from the ionization systems in Oman, 50 million gallons a day for the desalination system in Carlsbad, California. I just find this fascinating, the energy comparison to get that added water. Okay, the power input into the ionization systems is relatively low, like we just said, operating in a high voltage but low power, triggering the condensation of water that's already there, allowing you to get, based on these figures, obviously it's gonna be different for different systems and different locations, you know, but for this trial, from the numbers we have, you're getting about 3.7 million gallons of fresh water per kilowatt hour of electricity. Whereas with desalination, you're talking about 0.00008 million gallons per kilowatt hour, right? Desalination is pretty energy intensive. Again, it's still something we absolutely need to do, but it's worth just looking at this difference. You get 50,000 times more water per unit energy, electricity input, comparing ionization versus desalination. You know, again, not all the water from ionization, precipitation, you know, is as immediately available as with desalination, but it's certainly a fascinating comparison to make, just to give you a sense of the importance. And also these ionization systems can be set up pretty rapidly and relatively cheaply compared to with, you know, other available options. And to put it back in the context of the water cycle, you know, you don't create the water, obviously, right? You have water evaporated in the atmosphere above these stations, above these systems, right? And you're increasing the rate at which that water condenses and precipitates to the ground. Done in the right way, you can utilize these systems to help not just take the water that's already there in the atmosphere above these systems, but also help to draw additional water vapor from over the ocean inland. So you're increasing, again, the water input into the cycle as a whole. You're not just taking water that would rain somewhere else and making it rain here instead, right? You could see how that might get a little problematic. But you're actually increasing the total amount of atmospheric water vapor that could rain at all. So you're increasing the total input of fresh water availability into the system by drawing in fresh water from over the ocean, which would otherwise precipitate, fall as rain back into the ocean, right? And most of the water that gets evaporated from the ocean does that. Only like 10%, I think, only a small fraction of the water that gets evaporated from the ocean ends up precipitating over land, right? So you're going to increase that input of fresh water, of atmospheric water vapor that's available over land, and increase the supply of atmospheric water vapor to generate rain where you want it, when you want it over land, right? So this weather modification is, I think, an incredibly important aspect of emergency measures that could be taken immediately to begin solving the drought crisis. And like I said, I'm going to again state this, this is a evolving process that we're dealing with. We don't have a final solution, but my contribution to the ongoing discussion for a drought action plan would be something along these lines. You would probably want to take ionization systems and develop them up and down the coast, not just California, up into Oregon, Washington, probably on the scale of 100 to 200 times what was done in the Oman trials, right? And you want to try and push this water vapor inland as far as possible, increase the precipitation into the watersheds, which feed the streams and rivers, which then feed into things like this Sacramento River, that feed into the San Joaquin River, right? You're increasing the precipitation input that then supplies all of the existing water infrastructure as much as possible. And you can also look at putting these things inland. This is something I haven't really had a chance to study in depth. But you could look at places where you have various continental divides, right? You have boundaries, high mountain range, high elevation points, where any water that falls on one side versus the other side of that continental divide ends up in one watershed or another, and ends up going into one river or another, right? So if water that ends up going into the Missouri River and then into the Mississippi River versus water that, I'm not sure off the top of my head what's a neighboring basin. I'm not sure if the Colorado Basin directly neighbors the Missouri Basin, but you get the idea, right? There might be places where you already have fairly high levels of precipitation in one basin. Maybe you can direct some of that precipitation into another basin and help feed and augment and build up the water supply in basins where it's needed further inland, like the Colorado River Basin, the Upper Colorado River Basin, and other locations. Right, so that's an aspect that can be looked at. I know there were studies in China looking at some very interesting applications of weather control systems, thought of in a very similar way, where they wanted to use them in very high elevation locations to direct precipitation into the watersheds, which then feed into their south water, north water transfer systems. So it's a very interesting aspect of the whole thing, potentially using it inland in certain locations. But definitely coast is where you start, right? Desalination, if we just go by the numbers we looked at there in terms of the 25 million people on the coast of California, you probably want something on the order of 25 desalination plants of the size of the one in Israel, the Sorek plant. If you want to supply more water than that, you're going to need more plants, right? So if you want to begin to supply water that you can bring further inland, right? Pump it further inland to more inland areas like Sacramento, right? Or maybe use it further up the coast, Oregon, Washington, you're going to need more plants, right? So we should be talking a minimum of 25 Sorek-sized desalination plants. If not more, maybe up to 50. You probably want to also look at doing these in the Gulf, on the Texas coast of the locations, right? We want to really address the water crisis. And then surface water transfer. And I would pose it like this: you want to work towards NWAPA, but you don't want to start from Alaska and work your way down. You want to start from the Sacramento and Colorado rivers and begin connecting them with closer rivers that have some extra capacity that could add to the system. So like we were looking at earlier, the Missouri River, that would be a big project, but that could be connected potentially into some elements of what becomes Nawapa. The Columbia River is part of the Nawapa design. The Skeena and Fraser rivers are in British Columbia. They're decent sized rivers, and they're part of the full Nawapa design. They're part of the catchment system for Nawapa, right? So if we had an agreement, if we get an agreement with Canada on serious water development for the West, you want to start building towards Nawapa, which would be an extensive project, but to get benefits as rapidly as possible, let's just start and from the south and work our way up, basically, right? So all of these things I think could be started immediately, and they're not all going to deliver benefits as quickly, right? I think the ionization systems could be probably delivering benefits most rapidly on a substantial scale. Desalination, although the technology is not as well known, so you can't guarantee exactly what it can do and how much it can do. We've seen an immense demonstration of the potential of it, and should be brought online immediately and see how far we can push it. At the same time, we can go with more trusted desalination technologies, as Mike Carr covered in his article, push towards new technological breakthroughs that'll make those more efficient, and then start also building surface water transfer systems, which I think are still going to be an integral part of this whole package of solving the crisis, right? And if we need to take emergency measures as needed, right, we might need to be trucking in water to save cities. I mean, that happened in the last drought. It's probably going to happen again. You have to just truck water in to save populations. If we need to bring in desalination systems on the existing systems on naval ships, which is something that's been discussed, that can be done, although they're not huge in capacity. If you have a small population that's in desperate need, that's something that can be done. But we got to start building out serious, actual solutions that'll provide relief as quickly as possible, but also move us towards solving the crisis for the long term, right? So that's the drought issue. That's the water issue. And when you're talking about these ionization systems, you're immediately getting into this whole climate discussion. Because as I referenced briefly at the beginning, these ionization systems, in a certain sense, are really kind of mimicking off of real climate science, a real understanding of how the activity from our sun, the relation of our solar system to our galaxy, where our solar system is in our galaxy, what our galaxy is doing as a whole, how active it is, how much star formation is occurring, right? These cosmic conditions have a substantial impact on the climate of the Earth, and climate change in particular, the variations in the climate. And this is the area of science that really should be developed and pursued and understood, and we should abandon all these crazy climate models. So I just wanted to, just touching on that, what this is something we've covered extensively. I'm not going to go into all of it, but just to put it on the table in the context of what we're talking about, because obviously Newsom, Biden, John Kerry, all these people are screaming about climate change. And when they say that, they're implying, they're, asserting that it's human-driven climate change is the cause of the drought, is the cause of this crisis, is the problem, and it's all bunk. It's all bunk. You have, we know we have a greenhouse effect. We know human CO2 emissions are a contributor to that greenhouse effect, right? They increase it, right? That's known. But then to make the leap to say that not just CO2, but the human additional contributions of CO2 into the atmosphere from human activity is the main driver of all the changes occurring in the climate and associated weather conditions is a complete crazy leap of faith. And a lot of it comes down to these models, these climate models, which are a reductionist backwards scientific approach. They're trying to model what is an incredibly complex, incredibly interrelated dynamic system with factors spanning multiple phase spaces of activity in the universe, right? And they're trying to add up all the contributions and cross contributions and feedback effects and nonlinear effects between all of these phase spaces, between these systems, to try and extrapolate out, applying as much computing power as they can to try and generate some model of the entire climate system. And they fail, and they fail, and they fail. Every year after year after year, they keep putting these things out. They keep using these as the basis for scare stories, right? And they don't work. When they make a forecast based on these models, a couple of years go by, we look at the reality compared to what the models were saying. The models weren't right, so they just tweak the model, and then they do another forecast to try and scare people again to push their agenda, right? But I just wanted to cite this just to give you a sense of what you're really talking about when you're talking about the climate system, right? You have the greenhouse effect, and you have human contribution to the greenhouse effect. That's an element. That's one element. You have the atmospheric system. You have atmospheric patterns. You have the Coriolis effect. You have the polar vortex regions, right? You have a highly complex system of structures just in the atmospheric circulation system itself alone, right? Which, we can only forecast out, a few days if you look at basic weather forecasting, right? You have cloud formation. You have different types of cloud formations. You have different types of clouds. You have clouds at different elevations. They have different effects on the energy budget, the solar energy input into the system, and so on. We can't model these things. We don't know how the clouds work, right? You have ocean systems. You have the interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere. You have ocean circulation patterns, and on, right? And then on top of all that, you have the biosphere. You have life. Life has substantially changed the atmospheric chemistry, and it's constantly maintaining a certain disequilibrium, energetic, chemical conditions in the atmosphere and in water systems through its activity. So changes in things that affect the biosphere change how the biosphere then comes back and affects changes on life in the biosphere, change how life impacts the biosphere, atmospheric conditions, and so on. Water vapor produced through plant transpiration is a major contributor to the entire system, just to cite one example, right? And then you have solar activity and the activity from our galaxy, right? So that's just to give you a sense of, what you're really dealing with when you're talking about the climate. And this approach of just saying, well, we're gonna add up all the pairwise effects and try and integrate and build up the cumulative impact of all of these systems is a failed approach to even science. And I wouldn't even call it science, right? It's just modeling. And if we really want to get into some serious climate science, you want to begin to look at these frontier questions of how the Earth system, largely determined by the biosphere, but now increasingly determined by the noosphere, by human activity, as a totality is intersecting with the solar system and the sun's activity and the variations of the sun's activity, as that system is interacting with the galaxy and our position in the galaxy, and changes in our galactic environment, and changes in what the galaxy is doing as a whole, right? And you want to start from a top-down perspective of looking at the interaction and interplay, the dynamic interaction in the sense that LaRouche developed that term, interplay between these systems, and not just study it, but how can we manage it? How can we control it? And instead of modeling on computers, we should be doing active experimentation and testing and investigation with these ionization systems to solve our water challenges, to provide the water we need, but also provide us a better sense of how the climate system actually operates through active experimentation, starting from the standpoint of the top-down dynamics of the system as a whole as an intersection between these phase spaces, right? Galactic, solar, biospheric, and now noetic. All these phase spaces are interacting. And in this region of interaction is where you have the climate, as we call it. So moving into the future, if we can defeat these failed policies and failed politicians, people like the Biden and the people backing the Biden collective and so on, and we can implement real pro-humanist, pro-future growth perspectives, this is the kind of stuff we're going to be doing. So that's what we got to fight for. So, there's a lot more we can take up. I think we'll probably continue some of this next week because there's a lot more on the galactic climate science that I think would be useful to get into in a little more detail. But I think that's probably plenty for today. And I look forward to the discussion.